Lightroom CC can now stitch together multiple RAW files to create seamless panoramas without rendering the files as pixels. In fact, the panorama that Lightroom creates is just as much of a RAW file as the originals. We'll begin by selecting these images, and instead of going to Edit In, I'll choose Photo Merge and then Panorama. You'll notice I could also use the keyboard shortcut Control-M. Lightroom displays a preview of the resulting merge to confirm that the source images can be successfully stitched together. This preview window can be expanded. However, for performance reasons, this preview image area has a maximum of 2048 pixels across the long edge on the high DPI displays such as the Retina display, or a maximum of 1024 pixels on a non-Retina display. Obviously, these images stitch together horizontally, but it's good to know that you can also stitch vertical panoramas. There are 3 different projection options to choose from, plus Auto. When you select Auto, Lightroom will automatically apply the projection that it determines is most appropriate. But if you prefer to take control, you can choose from any of the 3 options. When I select Perspective, this option uses the image in the middle of the panorama as the reference image. Then, to seamlessly match the rest of the images in the panorama, Lightroom will need to reposition, stretch, or skew the images on either side of this center image. These transformations might produce a panorama that looks like a bow tie, with the images at either end taller than at the center. The cylindrical option is best suited for creating really wide panoramas. Again, Lightroom uses the center image as the reference image. However, when it stitches the other images together, it matches the overlapping content as if each image was mapped on an unfolded cylinder, minimizing the bow tie effect that you would see with the perspective option. The spherical option aligns and transforms the images as if they were mapped on the inside of a sphere. And although we don't see a large change in this example, this method works best when creating 360-degree panoramas. If we turn on Auto Crop, Lightroom will trim off any uneven edges around the panorama. If you have Auto Crop turned off, you'll see the white space around any of the uneven areas, but either way, the crop is non-destructive and completely adjustable after the panorama is created. Once we start the panorama stitching, we can see that it will be performed in the background. This allows us to continue to edit other photos or start other merges while the file is being generated. In fact, if you want to start another panorama using the same settings as the previous one, you can select the files and then set the next one to render using the keyboard shortcut Shift plus Control plus M, which will bypass the dialog box. We can see that once the full-size panorama is complete, the resulting DNG file is automatically added to the Lightroom catalog. Alright, let's move over to the Develop module by tapping the D key. And the first thing that you need to know is that if you've made adjustments to the individual images prior to choosing Photo Merge, not all of those adjustments will carry over to the merged file. For example, if you've made local adjustments such as applying maybe a radial or a graduated filter or painting in selected areas with the adjustment brush, if you've done that to individual exposures, those adjustments will not be applied to the merged file. Because of this, I would suggest that you don't spend a great deal of time making adjustments to each of the individual exposures in the panorama, but instead merge the images and then make the adjustments. Let's go ahead and make a few adjustments here. I'll use the basic panel and click the Auto button. Then I want to decrease the exposure a little bit, but my shadows get too dark, so I'll move my shadow slider up to the right. I could also bring back a little bit of detail in my highlights or the cloud area by moving my highlight slider to the left. And then I'll use my white slider and just bring it up a little bit to make sure that I'm using the full dynamic range of the histogram. I'll bring up the clarity a little bit in the presence area and increase the vibrance. But I think the sky is getting a little bit too blue, so I'll come down to HSL, grab my targeted adjustment tool, click on saturation, and then click in the blue sky and drag down to desaturate. But now it's too light, so I'll move over to luminance and click and drag down to just darken it a bit. If I tap the R key, then I get the crop tool and I can go in and make any necessary crops. Once I tap return or enter, it appears as if the image has been cropped, but of course, like all of the adjustments in the Develop module, it's non-destructive, and if I tap the R key again, we could go in and we could refine that crop. One last important note in the Develop module, because stitching works best on images that have had lens distortions corrected, Lightroom will automatically apply a lens correction profile whenever possible, regardless of whether or not you've applied it to the individual exposures. All right, let's return back to the grid view by tapping the G key, because I want to point out that the newly created file, this panorama DNG file, is not tied to any of the images that were used to create it. It's an independent image, so making changes to the panorama will not automatically update the source images. Finally, here are 4 important tips when using the new panorama photo merge. Lightroom needs access to the original files when creating a panorama. Your smart previews won't suffice, so your source images need to be online and accessible. There's a size limit of 64,000 pixels on the long side of a file or 512 megapixels, whichever comes first. If you want to quickly find your panorama images, we can use the text option in the filter area and type in -pano because Lightroom automatically appends the file name when creating panoramas. And finally, for those of you who want to create high dynamic range panoramas, we'll take a look at this example here. Here I've started with 21 different exposures, and we can see that for each kind of panel in my panorama, I have 3 different exposures. I'll tap the N key so that we can see them all. So I have a underexposed, a middle exposure, and an overexposed image for each one of the exposures that I want to use to make up my panorama. So the first thing that I did was I selected each one of these groups and then right mouse clicked, chose Photo Merge, and then merged each set using the HDR Merge option. What that resulted in were these 7 independent, newly created, merged HDR files. I then selected all of those, right mouse clicked again, chose Photo Merge, and this time I selected Panorama. The end result was this image right here. I'll tap the Tab key so we can see it a little bit larger, and here we have a high dynamic range raw panorama. So there you have it, an easy new method for creating the highest possible quality panoramas directly within Lightroom CC.